Hi everyone, my name is Meredith Ruff. I am a Labor Standards Engagement Specialist at the City of Seattle Office of Labor Standards, which means that I do outreach, and today I am going to be walking you through a training on the City of Seattle's Secure Scheduling Ordinance. Before we get into this presentation, I just want to let you know that the presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not for the purpose of providing legal advice, creating an agency decision, or establishing an attorney-client relationship between OLS and anybody who is watching this. And OLS is the Office of Labor Standards, for those who don't know. Any responses or kind of thoughts about specific scenarios are based on the facts as they are written, as we understand them, and they're not intended to apply to other situations. If you need legal advice, please consult with an attorney. And before I get into the presentation, I want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands and waters of the Coast Salish and Duwamish people, who include the federally recognized Muckleshoot and Suquamish tribes and the Duwamish tribe. These tribes are the original past, present, and future stewards of these lands and waters. I want to honor them with gratitude, especially as I live on this land. I also want to acknowledge the Treaty of Point Elliott and the Medicine Creek Treaty and understand the importance they have in protecting Indigenous people and their sacred homeland. And I want to say that this statement was developed by Rita Gray, Master's in Education, who is Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. Okay, so what are the goals of this training? We want to learn about the Secure Scheduling Ordinance. We want to understand what employers have to do under this ordinance, and we want to provide you with resources for knowing your rights, asking questions, or filing a complaint. A couple of these resources just right off the bat. The first one is this workplace poster, which should be available at all workplaces in, for instance, a break room. The workplace poster goes over minimum wage, wage theft, paid sick and safe time, fair chance employment, and Seattle's commuter benefit ordinance. Your employer should have that available in English and whatever language the employees speak, and they're supposed to display it at your workplace, but you can also download this poster in many languages on the OLS website, and you can get there by scanning the QR code. The second of these resources right off the bat is the Secure Scheduling poster, which has written information on the rights that we'll be discussing in this presentation. You can also download that poster in multiple languages on the OLS website and get there via the QR code. Okay, secure scheduling, that's what we're here for. That's Seattle Municipal Code 14.22. If you want to look up the code yourself, it's right there. And kind of digging into the ordinance, the first question that a lot of people have is who is covered, and we're going to be primarily talking about employees and that sort of coverage. So employees, if you work for a business that is a retail or food service business, that business has 500 or more employees worldwide, and that includes all franchises. It does not matter who owns the franchise, but if there are 500 or more employees worldwide, as part of this larger business, that would be covered. And then just a little bit more information. If whatever business you're talking about is a full service restaurant, then it has to have at least 40 full service locations worldwide in order to fall under the Secure Scheduling Ordinance. So that's the type of business you have to be working for in order to be covered. And then as an employee, you have to work as an hourly worker. You have to work or report to a fixed point of sale location, and that fixed point of sale location means you work at one location where employees are selling to customers. And the reason that it's important that it could be somebody who works actually at the location or report to that location is because reporting to that location can include like delivery drivers and installation workers who do report to those locations but don't necessarily stay there. And then the final thing you have to be as a worker in order to be covered by this ordinance is that you have to work at a Seattle location for at least 50% of your work time. So if you do not work at a Seattle location for at least 50% of your work time, you will not be covered by the ordinance. But if you check all of these boxes, then you are covered by the Secure Scheduling Ordinance. So that is who it applies to. And now we're going to talk about what it actually does. So under the secure scheduling law, employers have to provide you with a good faith estimate of your hours every quarter. And that estimate doesn't guarantee hours. It just says, like, this is how much we think that you'll be working. Doesn't mean this is how much you will definitely be working. But if there's a significant change in your work schedule, you should get a new estimate so that it's not too far off from what you're actually working. Employers also have to offer additional hours to employees before hiring, to their current employees before they hire new employees to cover those hours. Employers have to take the workers' preferences into account when they're scheduling shifts. They have to provide you your schedule at least 14 days in advance, and importantly, respect your right to decline any hours that were not posted in the original schedules. When they do make schedule changes outside of that 14 days advance notice, then they have to pay you extra for those schedule changes unless an exception applies, and we will get into those. Employers also have to give you a 10-hour break between closing and opening shifts and pay you extra if you do not get that 10-hour break. This presentation will mostly focus on all but the first bullet points, but if you do want more information about that good faith estimate, for instance, you can go to the OLS website, which we'll link to at the end of the presentation, and get more information about that. Okay, so one of the things we just talked about was that the employer has to provide you with your schedule 14 days in advance. So that's 14 days before the first day listed on the schedule. The schedule that they give you in advance has to include the hours, days, and times for all regular and on-call shifts, including the specific start and end times for each shift. So you should be getting all of that information 2 weeks in advance. The schedule has to be posted where employees can see it in English and whatever the primary language of the employees at that location are, and that is to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what the schedule says. You also, as I mentioned, have a protected right not to work shifts that are scheduled with less than 14 days advance notice. If you are disciplined or experience any kind of negative action tied to you declining a work shift that was scheduled outside of that 14-day notice period, that would be called unlawful retaliation, and we will get into what retaliation means at the end of the presentation. Okay, we talked about 14 days in advance. Before that schedule comes out, you actually have the right to request input into your work schedule. So you can make requests for a particular schedule. That could be days of the week, start and end times of shifts. You can also make a request for working in a certain location. You do not have a right to request a specific number of hours, so you can't just say, I would like to work 35 hours per week and expect them to have to agree to that. You also can't ask for a specific number of days a week, like, oh, I would like to reduce my schedule from 4 days to 3 days, or I would like to work an additional day, but you should still be able to have input on which days of the weeks those are, which shifts those are, and what location you're working at. So you give them this input, then what do they have to do with it? By them, I mean your employer. If the request is based on something called a major life event, your employer has to talk to you about it, has to engage in some sort of interactive process, and they also have to grant the request unless they have a good reason, which we call a bona fide reason, that the secure scheduling law states is an acceptable reason to deny your request. And so those reasons are listed out in the law, and you can find those reasons on our website, like reasons that it's okay for them to say no to your request for a specific schedule. And again, I will link to that later in the presentation. But what is a major life event? Helpful to know when you're asking for something, when should they have to grant it unless they have one of those bona fide reasons. So a major life event is like another one of your jobs. So you need a particular schedule so that you can go to both jobs. It could be your responsibilities as a caregiver, including responsibilities related to the care and education of children. like parent-teacher meetings. It could be your enrollment in an educational or training program, so you need a specific schedule so that you can go to classes or attend seminars, things like that. Could be a change in your housing or your transportation, so you need a different schedule because now you work further away and you can't make the shift that's in the morning, but you could make the one later, that type of thing. And it could be your own serious health condition. So if you know, for instance, that you're going to have to get treatment on particular days or other issues with your serious health condition, that is a reason why your employer should grant your schedule request and actually has to grant your schedule request unless they have one of those good reasons for denying it. If you make a schedule request based on a major life event, like the ones listed above, and your employer denies that request, the reason for your denial has to be in writing, and it has to provide their reason for denying your request, because again, it can only be a bona fide business reason, and those are listed out in the law. If the schedule is not based on a major life event, your employer still has to talk to you about your preferences, but they can grant or deny the request. They are not required to grant it unless they have a good reason for saying no. And something that's not a major life event could be something like, oh, I have this concert that I want to go to on Thursday night, so I don't want to work that day. Like, they don't have to grant those particular requests. Okay, so we talked about requesting input. And now we're going to talk about pay for schedule changes. So if your employer changes your schedule with less than 14 days notice, they have to pay you for those schedule changes unless an exception applies. And as I said, we will talk about what some of those exceptions might be. So if they add time to your schedule, and that has to be more than 15 minutes, they would pay you for the added time that you worked at your normal rate. And then if the extra amount that you worked is between 16 and 59 minutes, so more than 15 minutes but less than an hour, then they would add you an extra 16 to 59 minutes of pay on top of paying you for actually working that extra amount of time. If they add an hour or more of work, they have to pay you, again, for the number of hours that you worked, and then they also have to pay you an extra hour of pay, one extra hour of pay. So for example, if your employer said, oh, I want you to work 2 more hours, it's not in that 14-day advance, it's less than 14 days before they want you to work this shift, then they would owe you for the 2 hours of work that you actually did, and then 1 hour of extra pay. If they are not adding or subtracting hours, they're just changing the start and end time of a shift or the day of a shift, they owe you an hour of pay. And then if they're subtracting time, and that's more than 15 minutes of time, they would pay for half of the time that you're no longer working. So say you are supposed to work an 8-hour shift, but your boss says, oh, we don't actually need you to work that. We only need you to work 4 hours. That means that they subtracted 4 hours from your schedule, and they have to pay you for half of that time. So they have to pay you for 2 hours at your normal rate. Okay, so I said exceptions would apply, and now we're going to get into those exceptions. Why don't they have to pay, or why wouldn't they have to pay you these extra amounts? So your employer does not have to pay for schedule changes when you requested the schedule change in writing, you agreed to swap shifts or cover for somebody else. Your hours have been reduced because of discipline, and that discipline is documented in writing, or the employer can't begin or continue to operate for specific reasons, and more information about what those specific reasons are available on the website. So you don't have to agree to changing your schedule, but if you do agree to changing your schedule and it's one of these things, they don't have to pay you extra. And there are actually more reasons, which I want to get into a little bit more depth. So another reason why they wouldn't have to pay for a schedule change that is outside of that 14-day advance notice period, there's something called a mass communication that they can send. So say you accept a schedule change after your employer contacts 2 or more of the workers or employees in writing about additional hours when another employee can't work. So if that's something that happens to you and you agree to take those hours, that's something that they wouldn't have to pay you extra for, but they have to do some very specific things in order to not pay that extra. So the first thing is that this, again, has to be a written message that goes to 2 or more employees, and the message has to say in it that it is a mass communication, that accepting the added hours is voluntary and that you can decline accepting those hours, and that accepting the hours will not require them to pay the extra amount. So they have to give you all of this information. Otherwise, they would still have to pay the extra amount. And I'm just going to emphasize this multiple times. You do not have to agree to working more hours if they haven't given you that 14 days advance notice. Another reason that they don't have to pay for adding or subtracting hours for schedule changes is when your employer asks a group of 2 or more workers in person while you are still at work if you're willing to work extra hours that shift because of unanticipated customer needs. And this specific exception is called an in-person group communication. So in order to not pay out for adding hours to your shift that you're currently working, your employer must say at least 2 things. They have to say that extending time beyond the scheduled shift is voluntary and you can decline. And they also have to let you know that accepting the hours will not require them to pay any extra amount. Again, one of the important pieces of this is that it has to be a group of 2 or more workers, and it has to be in person while you are on that shift. I'll emphasize this once more. Your employer asks you this, they tell you all the right things, they tell you, this is voluntary, you can decline, and we're not going to pay you extra if you do accept. You do not have to accept working more hours. You can just say, no, I'm going to work the shift that I was scheduled for, I'm going to leave at my scheduled time. And if they discipline you for doing that, that would be unlawful retaliation. Okay. So we talked about the extra pay, when don't they have to pay? Now we're going to talk about breaks between opening and closing shifts. So employers cannot schedule or require employees to work closing and opening, I'm just going to call them clopening, shifts that are less than 10 hours apart unless you, the employee, asks to or you agree to. And this is called the right to rest. To get the protections of the right to rest, the shift, kind of the second shift, has to be scheduled less than 10 hours after the end of the previous day's shift or a shift that happened across 2 days. So for example, if you work an 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift and then you're scheduled for another shift less than 10 hours after that, that would be a violation of the right to rest unless you volunteer or you agree to do that work. Even if you do volunteer or you do agree to work those shifts, your employer has to pay you time and a half for all the hours before you hit that 10-hour mark. So again, you work an 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift, they ask you to come back in at noon. That's only 8 hours between the end of your shift and the start of the new shift, so they would have to pay you time and a half for the first 2 hours when you come back to work at noon. Important, employers can't discipline or punish any employees who decline to work those clopening shifts that are less than 10 hours apart. So that is a protected right that you have. You can say, I have a right to rest. I have a right to working shifts that are at least 10 hours apart. And so no, I don't want to work that shift that doesn't meet those requirements. One of the kind of end things we'll talk about is access to hours. That just means before hiring anyone else to cover more hours, employers have to offer the additional hours to qualified employees who already work for them. So they can't hire outside before they at least give people the option to take the hours that are on the table. So in order to follow this law, your employer has to let everyone know in writing about the additional hours for at least 3 days. they have to offer the hours to the employees who respond and are qualified. And once they make that offer, they have to give 2 days for that employee to accept the hours. We're going to get a little bit into scenarios, so hopefully this will kind of come more into the real world. So Mahmoud works at Snake Snack, which is a chain restaurant with more than 500 employees worldwide. Mahmoud is paid $20 per hour. During Mahmoud's 12 to 6 p.m. shift, his manager tells him that they need help and he should stay until 8 p.m. Mahmoud agrees to work past his originally scheduled hours. In this situation, Snake Snack owes Mahmoud pay for the 8 hours he worked. He worked 12 to 8 p.m., so they got to pay him for that whole time, plus an extra hour of pay, which is $20, for the schedule change. Because there was a schedule change outside of that 14 days advance notice, so he is owed that extra hour of pay. To avoid paying that extra hour of pay, the manager would have needed to meet that in-person group communication requirement. So again, that's you're on the shift, your manager talks to 2 or more people, lets everybody know that accepting is voluntary to work those, the extra hours, and that they're not going to pay you out for the extra hours. All of those things would have needed to happen in order for them to not have to pay Mahmoud. And then another scenario, which is on adding a shift. So after an employee calls out sick, the manager calls all employees to find replacement coverage. When she reaches Maria, one of her workers, she tells her, "I'm reaching out to see if you want to work the Wednesday shift. It's up to you. Would you like to volunteer?" Maria tells her, "Sure, I'll volunteer." And the question is any of that extra pay owed? The answer to that question is yes. Even though Maria volunteered to take the shift, because the manager just requested and contacted employees individually, the employer has to pay 1 hour of additional pay for adding the hours because they did not send it as a mass communication, and that's what's required to not have to pay the extra. If the manager had sent a mass communication, including all of the required information to all employees, and in response, Maria took on the extra shift, then additional compensation would not have been owed. So I hope those scenarios kind of helped you see how this might play out in a workplace and kind of give you the tools to know when should you be getting that extra pay and when are your employers doing everything that they need to do to fall under one of the exceptions. And before I leave you, we're just going to talk about retaliation. So this is a right in almost every Seattle labor ordinance, and it just means employers cannot take adverse, negative, or discriminating action against employees who are asserting their rights in good faith, which means they really think that these rights apply to them. And employee actions that would be covered by retaliation or the prohibition on retaliation include but aren't limited to, like asking about your rights under the ordinances, informing your employer, your union, or legal counsel about an alleged violation, filing a complaint about alleged violations, participating in an investigation about alleged violations, or informing other employees of their rights under the ordinance. So if you as a worker are taking any of these actions and then your employer acts negatively towards you, discriminates against you, kind of takes anything away from you, that would likely be unlawful retaliation. And I'll give you a scenario. So during his shift at Snake Snack, Dante's manager asks him and the other 3 employees working if they can stay past the time listed on their schedules in order to close. Dante does not want to stay late, so he declines the extra hours. Before the next schedule comes out, Dante's manager says that they're cutting Dante's hours because he's not a team player and won't stay after his shift to close. And so Dante's protected action is that you do not have to accept hours that are not on your 14-day in advance schedule. You can decline them. You have a right to do that. And because he had that right, standing up for himself, and the manager acts negatively towards him by cutting his hours, that would be unlawful retaliation. All right, folks, just before I leave you, here are some resources. If you as a worker have a question and you want to ask it or you want to file a complaint, you can scan the QR code or you can call the number on the screen, and that should get you to our complaint form. We also have a lot of information on the website and specifically about secure scheduling. If you scan this QR code, this is where the ordinance lives, the law itself, the rules, which are a little bit more in detail about how the law applies, and then our question and answer document, which is long and it has a lot of information in it and it answers a lot of questions. So all of those resources are available to you, and if you have questions, please reach out.